For my 28th birthday, my grandfather handed me a folded check for $200,000 across the dining room table. 10 minutes later, my own brother locked the heavy oak doors of the dining room, backed me into a corner, and slapped me across the face so hard I tasted blood. "Hand it over, or I am calling the police and telling them you assaulted me," he warned. I shattered a glass door to escape and took that blood-stained check straight to the bank. The manager typed the routing number into his system, went completely pale, and locked his computer terminal. "Ma'am, do not move. I have to call the authorities. My name is Raven. I am 28 years old, and my family thought I was just a disposable scapegoat. If you have ever survived a toxic family that tried to destroy you for their own greed, tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe, because you will want to see exactly how I used that single piece of paper to dismantle a criminal empire and bring my abusive relatives to their knees. Growing up in a wealthy African-American household in Atlanta meant living in a constant state of performance. Our sprawling estate in Buckhead, with its towering columns and perfectly manicured lawns, was a fortress of appearances. My parents, Patricia and Desmond, cared about status more than oxygen. To the outside world, my father was a respected community leader, and my mother was a flawless socialite. But inside those walls, the reality was suffocating. I was the family disappointment, the quiet girl who preferred data and spreadsheets over country club galas. My older brother Andre was the golden child. At 31, he was a charismatic real estate developer who could do no wrong. He had recently married Claire, a white woman from a fiercely wealthy predatory real estate family known as the Montgomerys. Claire had perfected the art of the delicate, well-intentioned daughter-in-law, smiling sweetly, while subtly putting me down at every opportunity. We were gathered around the massive mahogany dining table for my birthday dinner. The crystal glasses gleamed under the chandelier, but the atmosphere was thick with tension. My parents had spent the entire evening praising Andre for his latest business venture, completely ignoring the fact that it was supposed to be my celebration. Claire sat beside him, resting her manicured hand on his arm, nodding along as my mother gushed over their perfection. The only person who saw through their facade was my grandpa Elias. He sat at the head of the table, his 80-year-old eyes sharp and observant. He had built his wealth from nothing, a self-made patriarch who understood the value of hard work, unlike my brother who only knew how to exploit it. Dessert had just been cleared when Grandpa Elias reached into his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a crisp folded envelope and slid it across the polished wood directly toward me. "Happy birthday, Raven," he said, his voice raspy but firm. "Use this to build your own empire. Do not let them hold you down anymore." I opened the envelope, my breath catching in my throat. It was a cashier check made out to me for $200,000. Patricia gasped loudly, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. Desmond dropped his fork, the clatter echoing sharply in the quiet room. Andre leaned forward, his charismatic smile vanishing instantly, replaced by a dark, ravenous look of pure greed. Before anyone could speak, Grandpa Elias suddenly gasped. His hand shot to his chest, gripping his shirt tightly. His face contorted in sudden agony, and he slumped forward, collapsing against the edge of the table. The dining room erupted into absolute chaos. My mother screamed. My father rushed to his side, yelling for someone to call an ambulance. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the floor, but Andre blocked my path. Claire pulled out her phone, dialing emergency services with an exaggerated performance of panic, her voice trembling perfectly for the operator. Within minutes, paramedics swarmed the house. They loaded my grandfather onto a stretcher, rushing him out the front doors, with my parents following closely behind. In the blink of an eye, the house went from a crowded dinner party to an eerie, suffocating silence. I was left standing alone in the dining room with Andre and Claire. I clutched the envelope tightly in my hand, preparing to leave and follow the ambulance to the hospital. But as I turned toward the hallway, I heard the heavy metallic click of the deadbolt. Andre had locked the massive oak doors of the dining room. He turned to face me, the charming brother mask completely gone. Give me the check, Raven, he demanded, stepping slowly toward me. Grandpa is losing his mind. That money belongs to my company. I took a step back, my heart pounding against my ribs. It has my name on it, Andre. Grandpa wanted me to have it. I am not giving it to you. Andre lunged forward, closing the distance between us in a single stride. He grabbed my phone from my hand and shoved it into his pocket. You are nothing but a useless, selfish parasite, he hissed, towering over me. I stood my ground, refusing to hand over the envelope. That was when he raised his hand and brought it down hard across my face. The slap was deafening. The sheer force of it knocked me sideways, sending me crashing into the edge of the dining table. I tasted the sharp metallic tang of blood welling up in my mouth. I touched my lips, staring at the bright red stain on my fingertips. Always a parasite. Always the punching bag. Always the one forced to empty my college savings to cover his drunk driving settlements. Always the one pushed into the shadows so his golden light could shine. This was my role in the family, to bleed so he could thrive. You do not deserve a dime, Andre spat, hovering over me. Hand it over right now, or things are going to get much worse for you. Suddenly, from the other side of the locked doors, Claire began to scream. It was not a scream of fear. It was a calculated, hysterical performance. Help someone! Help me! She shrieked, banging her fists against the wood. Raven has gone crazy. She is attacking Andre. She is trying to steal the money. I froze, the realization hitting me like a bucket of ice water. Claire was already on the phone with the police. She was weaponizing her fragility, using her white woman tears to create a false narrative before the cops even arrived. In the eyes of the law, I would not be the victim of a brother assault. I would be the greedy, unstable sister who attacked her family to steal from a dying old man. Panic surged through my veins, but my mind, trained to analyze data and find solutions in high-pressure situations, snapped into focus. I could not stay here. If the police arrived and found me cornered by them, I would go straight to jail. I scanned the room, my eyes landing on a heavy, solid brass candlestick resting on the credenza. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the stinging pain in my jaw, and grabbed the brass fixture. Andre lunged for me, shouting a curse, but I was faster. I swung the candlestick with all my strength, smashing it directly into the center of the floor-to-ceiling glass patio doors. The tempered glass shattered into a million glittering pieces, showering the outdoor deck. I shoved the check deep inside my shoe, leaped through the broken frame, and sprinted into the manicured garden. The cool night air hit my face as I ran across the lawn, my heels sinking into the grass. I could hear Andre yelling behind me, his heavy footsteps crunching on the broken glass, but fear gave me speed. I reached my car, parked in the circular driveway, fumbled for my keys, and threw myself into the driver's seat. I slammed the locks down, just as Andre slammed his fists onto my window, his face contorted in rage. I threw the car into reverse, the tires screeching against the pavement, and sped out of the iron gates, leaving the toxic fortress behind. I drove frantically through the streets of Atlanta, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, my mind racing. I could not go to the police. Not yet. Not with Claire spinning her web of lies. I needed to secure the money. I needed to ensure the one thing my grandfather had given me was safe. I pulled into the parking lot of the local Chase Bank branch just 5 minutes before closing time. I rushed through the glass doors, my hair disheveled, my lip visibly swollen and bleeding. I bypassed the teller line and walked straight up to the branch manager, Mr. Caldwell, a man who had handled my grandfather's accounts for over a decade. He looked up, his eyes widening at my battered appearance. Raven, what on earth happened to you? He asked, rushing around his desk. I need to deposit this immediately, I said, pulling the crumpled, slightly blood-stained check from my shoe and placing it on his desk. Please, Mr. Caldwell, it is an emergency. Caldwell nodded quickly, returning to his computer terminal. He smoothed out the paper and typed the routing number into his system. I watched his face as he waited for the screen to load. I expected to see a confirmation, a nod that the funds were secure. Instead, I watched the color completely drain from his face. His skin turned an ashen gray, His hands began to tremble over the keyboard. He quickly minimized the window on his monitor and locked the screen with a sharp keystroke. He looked around the quiet bank lobby, then looked back at me, his eyes wide with genuine terror. "Ma'am?" he whispered, his voice shaking. "Please do not move. I have to call the police." Mr. Caldwell sat completely frozen behind his heavy mahogany desk. The pale light from his computer monitor cast a sickly blue shadow across his face. Raven stood on the opposite side of the desk, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. She watched his trembling fingers hover motionless above the keyboard. Her heart slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird desperately trying to break free. She had come to this bank seeking sanctuary, looking for a brief moment of refuge from the nightmare that had just unfolded at her family estate. She was still reeling from the shock of her grandfather collapsing and the sharp, lingering sting of her brother striking her across the face. But the safety she expected to find with her grandfather's most trusted bank manager was evaporating right before her eyes. Mr. Caldwell did not reach for the silent alarm button mounted beneath his desk to summon the local authorities. Instead, he slowly picked up the heavy black receiver of his secure landline. His eyes darted nervously toward the front glass doors of the bank lobby, as if expecting the shadows outside to suddenly shatter the glass. Raven took a slow and cautious step backward. Her mind, perfectly tuned by years of working as a senior data analyst in financial forensics, began to rapidly process the anomalies of his behavior. Caldwell was not dialing the local Atlanta police precinct. The sequence of numbers he punched into the keypad was far too long. He was dialing a direct federal extension. Raven knew those specific extensions intimately from her own corporate investigative work. He was calling the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Raven leaned forward over the desk, her voice dropping to a tight and desperate whisper as she asked him what was wrong with the check her grandfather had given her. Caldwell quickly covered the telephone receiver with his sweating palm. He looked up at her with a devastating mixture of profound pity and absolute terror. He explained in a hushed tone that the routing number printed on the bottom of the check was not linked to any of her grandfather Elias' personal wealth or legitimate business accounts. It was tied directly to a frozen offshore escrow account. Raven felt the blood rush away from her face, leaving her cold and numb. In her complex line of work, offshore escrow accounts that had been flagged and frozen by federal authorities meant only one thing. It meant massive, highly coordinated financial fraud. Caldwell confirmed her absolute worst fear as he kept his hand clamped over the phone. The account had been flagged 2 weeks ago by a specialized federal task force. They were actively investigating a predatory real estate ring that had been operating in the shadows of the city. The criminal ring had been systematically stealing property deeds and draining the equity from elderly Black homeowners across the greater Atlanta area. The puzzle pieces snapped together in Raven's mind with sickening and undeniable clarity. Andre, her golden child brother, the charismatic real estate developer who always seemed to close impossible deals and secure funding when no one else could. He was not a financial genius. He was a ruthless predator. But Andre was exceptionally careful. He was a coward who never left his own fingerprints on the weapon. Raven realized with a crushing wave of nausea why her own name was sounding the federal alarms in the banking system. Andre had used her. He had stolen her identity to serve as the perfect fall guy for his entire criminal operation. A senior forensic analyst setting up offshore accounts would look like the ultimate mastermind to a federal prosecutor. Andre had spent years slowly and methodically acquiring her social security number, copying her digital signatures, and mirroring her banking passwords under the guise of needing his brilliant sister to help him with minor corporate tax filings. He had built a trap around her while smiling in her face. It all made perfect sense now. Grandpa Elias did not slide that $200,000 check across the birthday dinner table as a simple gift to help her start a new life. Elias was a brilliant self-made man who saw everything happening in his family. He knew exactly what Andre was doing to their community. He knew Andre was framing Raven to take the ultimate fall for his crimes. Elias gave her the check because it was the only physical proof she would ever need to expose the truth. It was the golden key required to access the frozen ledger and decode the offshore accounts. By handing her the physical paper check, he had given her the ultimate weapon to destroy Andre's fake empire and clear her own name. He had risked everything to give her a fighting chance against her own brother. But before she could safely use it, her grandfather had collapsed from the poison running through his veins. And now the feds were actively watching this very transaction take place. The heavy and suffocating silence inside the bank was suddenly shattered by the piercing wail of police sirens approaching fast. Bright red and blue lights bounced frantically against the glass walls of the quiet lobby, illuminating the dark room with a violent rhythm. But these were not federal agents responding to Caldwell's call. They were local Atlanta patrol cars screeching to a chaotic halt right on the curb outside the main entrance. Raven spun around just in time to see the heavy bank doors violently pulled open. Claire burst into the room. Her sister-in-law was a flawless vision of manufactured distress and calculated panic. Claire threw her hands over her face, her blonde hair perfectly tousled, her expensive designer dress slightly rumpled, just enough to sell the performance of a terrified victim fleeing from danger. Claire pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at Raven. She collapsed dramatically against the chest of the nearest approaching police officer, sobbing hysterically into his uniform. She cried out that Raven had gone completely insane during a family dinner. She wailed to the officers that Raven had violently attacked Andre, in a jealous and psychotic rage stolen a massive check from a dying old man, and fled the scene like a violent criminal. Raven watched in absolute disgust as the local officers immediately softened their posture toward Claire. The weaponization of white tears was something Raven had witnessed throughout her entire life in the corporate world, but never had it been aimed directly at her own throat, with such lethal and immediate precision. Claire came from the Montgomerys, a legendary wealthy family of real estate vultures, and she knew exactly how to play the fragile, terrified victim, to command authority and manipulate the law in her favor. The responding officers did not stop to ask Raven for her side of the story. They did not ask for her identification or question why she was standing quietly at a teller desk. They simply saw a distressed white woman pointing an accusing finger at a black woman holding a blood-stained check. Two heavily built officers charged toward Raven with their hands on their utility belts. They grabbed her arms with aggressive force, twisting them painfully behind her back before she could even raise them in surrender. Raven gasped as the cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs bit brutally into her wrists, pinning her arms in a painful lock. She tried to speak desperately, trying to explain that the fresh blood on her face was from her brother assaulting her just moments ago. She tried to tell them that the check was a deliberate gift from her grandfather meant to expose a crime. But her frantic words were completely drowned out by Claire, who continued to sob loudly, burying her face deeper into the shoulder of the sympathetic deputy who was rubbing her back. The nightmare deepened into an unimaginable betrayal as another luxury car pulled up outside the flashing lights of the police cruisers. Patricia Raven's own mother stepped out into the chaotic scene. Raven felt a sudden, desperate surge of hope rise in her chest. Surely her mother would tell the officers the truth. Surely her mother, who had been sitting right at the table, would explain that Andre was the one who threw the punch and locked the doors. But as Patricia walked into the bank lobby, she did not even look at Raven with a single shred of maternal concern. Patricia walked straight past her struggling daughter and went directly to the police sergeant taking notes. Patricia shook her head, her face an absolute mask of tragic disappointment and parental exhaustion. She told the officers that her daughter had always been a deeply troubled and aggressive girl. She lied effortlessly to the police, stating with a steady voice that Raven had a long and documented history of mental instability and petty theft within the family. She claimed the family had been trying to get Raven psychiatric help for years, but that Raven had finally snapped tonight, assaulted her brother, and stolen her dying grandfather's money in a fit of greed. Raven stopped struggling against the officer's tight grip. The betrayal hit her far harder than the physical blow Andre had delivered earlier in the dining room. Her own mother was feeding her to the wolves to save her son. But as the shock washed over her, she realized this was not a new behavior. This was the exact same woman who had blamed an 8-year-old Raven when a teenage Andre broke a neighbor's window to avoid his punishment. This was the same mother who had forced Raven to take out predatory student loans so they could use the family savings to buy Andre a luxury car for his college graduation. Patricia had spent her entire life enthusiastically laying down Raven as a human bridge for Andre to comfortably walk across. The officers jerked Raven forward aggressively, shoving her toward the exit doors. The harsh, blinding lights of the police cruisers outside illuminated the grim reality of her situation. She was going to be locked away, and her brother was going to inherit the earth. Claire stood near the doorway, the heavy tears magically stopping the very moment the officers looked away from her face. Claire offered Raven a cold, triumphant smirk, stepping just close enough for only Raven to hear her voice over the sirens. Claire whispered that the ghetto always ends up exactly where it belongs. The officers shoved Raven firmly through the glass door, ignoring the blood dripping from her split lip. But as she stumbled past the main manager desk, Mr. Caldwell stepped forward from the shadows. He pretended to trip over his own feet, bumping incredibly hard into Raven's side. The officers immediately yelled at him to back away and stop interfering with an arrest. But in that split second of forceful physical contact, Raven felt a cold, jagged piece of metal slip silently and securely into the deep pocket of her slacks. She looked down at Caldwell as the officers pulled her away. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the floor, looking absolutely terrified but remarkably resolute. He muttered a loud, clumsy apology to the officers for losing his balance. But as he turned away to head back to his desk, his voice barely a breath against the noise of the lobby, he whispered a message meant only for her ears. "Elias said you would know which door this opens." The interrogation room was freezing, and the cold seeped through the thin fabric of my blouse to settle deep into my bones. I sat on a rigid metal chair bolted to the linoleum floor, while my wrists throbbed where the heavy steel handcuffs bit into my skin. The local police had strapped them on so tightly that my fingers were completely numb. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a relentless mechanical hum that filled the suffocating silence of the room. My jaw ached with a dull, heavy throb from where Andre had struck me just an hour ago. I could still taste the metallic tang of my own blood pooling behind my teeth. But the physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the crushing weight in my chest. My own mother had stood in the middle of the bank lobby and lied to the police. Patricia had looked at me with cold, empty eyes and told them I was mentally unstable. She told them I was a thief. She enthusiastically served me up to the authorities just to protect her precious golden son. Always a parasite, always the punching bag, always the sacrificial lamb laid out on the altar of his inflated ego. The betrayal burned through my veins like battery acid. My mother had spent my entire life protecting him, but watching her actively orchestrate my downfall to federal authorities was a new level of depravity. I shifted in the uncomfortable metal chair and felt the sharp edge of the small brass key pressing against my thigh. Mr. Caldwell had slipped the safety deposit box key into my pocket right before the police dragged away. My grandfather knew they would come for me. He knew my family was corrupt. He gave me the physical evidence I needed to access his frozen offshore accounts. The key in my pocket was my only lifeline. The heavy steel door of the interrogation room clicked and swung open with a loud groan. Andre walked in first. He wore a perfectly tailored designer suit that made him look like the legitimate businessman he desperately pretended to be. His charismatic smile was completely gone. In its place was a dark expression of arrogant superiority. Claire followed closely behind him. Her white privilege was practically a tangible weapon she wore like a shield. Her tears from the bank lobby had miraculously vanished. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and she held a designer handbag that cost more than my car. A third man stepped into the room behind them. He was an older white man wearing an impeccably expensive suit and carrying a dark leather briefcase. He had the cold, calculating eyes of a high-priced defense attorney. They stood on the opposite side of the metal table looking down at me like I was an insect they were preparing to crush. Andre placed his hands flat on the table and leaned forward. He did not bother with pleasantries or fake sibling concern. He laid out his ultimatum with ruthless precision. He told me the lawyer had already drafted a confession. The document stated that I would take the fall for a minor embezzlement charge regarding my grandfather's accounts. Andre demanded that I sign the confession and hand over the $200,000 check immediately. If I agreed to be a good, compliant little sister, he promised to use his wealth and influence to get me a lenient sentence. Perhaps just a few years in a minimum security facility. But if I refused to sign the paper, he promised to completely destroy me. He leaned closer so I could smell the expensive cologne radiating off his suit. He told me that with Claire's family connections and my mother's witness testimony, they would ensure I was charged with severe elder abuse and grand larceny. They would paint me as a violent sociopath who poisoned her own grandfather and tried to steal his fortune. He said they would make sure I rotted in a maximum security prison for the rest of my natural life. Claire stepped forward and placed her perfectly manicured hand gently on my shoulder. Her touch made my skin crawl with absolute revulsion. She looked down at me with a sickening display of patronizing fake sympathy. She told me to just be a good girl and take the deal. She whispered that I had always been so difficult and so stubborn, but now it was time to finally do the right thing for the family. She said that nobody would ever believe a troubled black woman over a respected real estate developer and his prominent white wife. She reminded me that the local police were already eating out of the palm of her hand. Her voice was dripping with condescension as she told me that my forensic accounting degree meant nothing in the real world where power and money dictated the truth. She patted my shoulder one last time and told me to just sign the paper so we could all go home. I sat perfectly still and let her words wash over me. I did not look at her or my brother. Instead, my eyes were locked completely on the lawyer's dark leather briefcase resting on the metal table. The ambient light caught the edge of the leather flap, revealing a subtle but distinct embossed logo. It was a golden compass crest surrounded by an intricate wreath. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that logo intimately from my years working as a senior data analyst specializing in financial forensics. It was the corporate crest of Montgomery Holdings, Claire's family empire. They were a massive, predatory real estate conglomerate known for ruthless acquisitions. My mind immediately kicked into analytical overdrive. I rapidly connected the scattered data points I had been studying for the past 6 months. The frozen offshore escrow accounts. The shell companies buying up properties in historically black neighborhoods across Atlanta. The aggressive eviction notices served to elderly homeowners. I had always assumed Andre was the mastermind behind the fraud. I had always believed my brother was using his charm and his fake black-owned development firm to steal from his own community. But as I stared at the Montgomery Holdings logo on the lawyer's briefcase, the horrifying reality snapped into perfect focus. Andre was not the criminal mastermind. He was completely incapable of executing a financial scheme of this magnitude. He was just a pawn. He was the acceptable black face used to bypass community suspicion while a wealthy white family systematically gentrified and pillaged the neighborhoods. Claire's family was using my brother to acquire properties they could never secure on their own. They were pulling the strings from the shadows while feeding his massive ego. And my brother was far too arrogant and far too desperate for their validation to realize he was merely a useful idiot in their generational wealth machine. They had promised him a seat at their country club table, and he had gleefully sold out his own blood to pay the admission fee. I slowly raised my head and looked directly into Andre's eyes. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of fear. I calmly explained exactly what I had just deduced. I watched the muscles in his jaw twitch as I told him he was nothing but a glorified errand boy for the Montgomery family. I told him that Claire and her father were using him as a human shield, and the moment the federal authorities closed in, they would throw him under the bus without a second thought. I broke down the financial structure of the offshore accounts, showing him that I understood the exact flow of the stolen money. I explained how his fake company was holding all the legal liability, while the Montgomery Empire harvested all the actual profit. I saw the brief flicker of realization and sheer panic register in his eyes. His inflated golden boy ego began to crack right there in the icy interrogation room. He looked nervously at Claire. Claire's fake sympathy instantly evaporated. Her eyes turned cold and dead like a shark circling wounded prey. The sweet protective wife act disappeared, and the ruthless corporate predator underneath was fully exposed. The lawyer quickly stepped in and demanded that I stop wasting their time. He pushed the written confession across the table, along with a silver pen. He told me this was my absolute final chance to save myself from total ruin. I looked down at the fabricated document filled with lies designed to protect a family that hated me. Always a parasite. Always the punching bag. I thought about my grandfather lying in a hospital bed fighting for his life, because he had dared to threaten their criminal enterprise. I thought about the small brass key resting safely in my pocket. I reached forward and pushed the paper back across the table. I calmly told them I would never sign their fake confession, and I would never give them the check. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the police mirror on the wall. I demanded my guaranteed one phone call. Andre slammed his fists on the table and shouted that I was making the biggest mistake of my life. Claire sneered and told the lawyer to let me make the call. She arrogantly stated that I had absolutely no one left in the world to help me, because my own parents had already abandoned me. She was entirely confident that my resistance was just a pathetic final bluff. The lawyer nodded and motioned to the guard outside the door. A local police officer walked in and uncuffed my right hand, leaving my left wrist firmly secured to the chair. He handed me a standard precinct landline phone and stepped back against the wall. They all watched me with smug anticipation, waiting for me to realize how completely isolated and helpless I truly was. They expected me to call a cheap local defense attorney or maybe leave a desperate crying voicemail for a friend. They had absolutely no idea what a senior financial data analyst was truly capable of doing with an open phone line. I picked up the receiver and listened to the dial tone. I did not call a lawyer. I dialed a highly classified internal sequence of numbers that connected directly to a secure backdoor server at my data analytics firm. The line rang twice before an automated voice system answered, asking for an access code. I brought the keypad close to my mouth and quickly punched in a complex string of dual-tone multi-frequency codes. Each beep of the phone button echoed loudly in the quiet interrogation room. Claire frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion as she watched my fingers move across the keypad. The automated voice prompted me for verbal authorization. I clearly stated my full name and my senior clearance level. The system authenticated my voice print immediately. I navigated through the hidden vocal menus with practice speed until I reached the secure directory holding my private investigative files. For the past 6 months, I had been quietly compiling a massive hidden database tracking the predatory real estate transactions across Atlanta. I had aggregated thousands of property deeds, routing numbers, offshore wire transfers, and public records, linking the fake development firm directly to Montgomery Holdings shell companies. I had built a digital bomb, and I had been waiting for the exact right moment to detonate it. The automated system asked me to confirm execution of the dead man switch protocol. I pressed the final required number on the keypad and hung up the phone. Andre laughed mockingly and asked if I had just left a message for a non-existent savior. I looked at him with a cold, unwavering stare and told him his entire empire was about to burn to the ground. The data sequence I had just triggered was a completely automated mass distribution script. At that very second, encrypted emails containing gigabytes of raw financial data, forensic accounting trails, and direct proof of the housing discrimination ring were flooding the inboxes of every major investigative journalist, federal prosecutor, and local news outlet in the greater Atlanta area. There was absolutely no way to stop the transmission, and no way to recall the files. The truth was already out in the wild, spreading like a digital wildfire across the city. The interrogation room fell into a tense and suffocating silence. 5 agonizing minutes slowly ticked by. The lawyer checked his expensive watch and told the officer to cuff my hand again, stating that the negotiation was officially over. Andre smiled and told me to enjoy my time in a concrete cell. Claire turned toward the door, clearly ready to go back to her mansion and celebrate her victory. But before she could even reach the handle, the heavy steel door burst violently open. The local police chief rushed into the small room. His uniform was disheveled, and his face was entirely pale and covered in a thick layer of sweat. He looked absolutely terrified. He completely ignored Claire and Andre and marched straight up to the officer guarding the wall. The chief barked a frantic order demanding that my handcuffs be removed immediately. The lawyer stepped forward loudly protesting and demanding to know what was happening. The police chief turned and yelled at the lawyer to step back. He loudly announced that the entire precinct had just been contacted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The chief stated that a massive federal mandate had just come down from Washington and all local jurisdiction over my case had been completely revoked. The FBI had officially ordered my immediate and unconditional release. Andre stepped backward, his eyes wide with sudden paralyzing fear. Claire opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. The protective bubble of their white privilege and local corruption had just been forcefully shattered by the weight of the federal government. The officer fumbled with his keys and quickly unlocked the heavy steel cuffs from my wrists. I stood up, rubbing my sore arms and stretching my fingers. I looked at my brother, who was now trembling visibly. I looked at Claire, whose arrogant smirk had entirely dissolved into sheer panic. I did not say a single word to either of them. I simply walked past them, leaving them trapped in the freezing interrogation room to face the catastrophic consequences of their own actions. I walked confidently down the long, bright hallway of the precinct. Police officers stepped out of my way, their eyes fixed firmly on the floor. The front glass doors of the station slid open, and the cold, crisp night air washed over my face. I was finally free. I stepped out onto the concrete pavement and took a deep breath. The city of Atlanta stretched out before me, glittering in the darkness. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my personal cell phone, which the desk sergeant had hurriedly returned to me on my way out. The screen lit up with dozens of missed call notifications and news alerts. The media was already breaking the story of the Montgomery Holdings scandal. But as I stood on the precinct steps, my phone suddenly buzzed with an incoming text message. It was from an unknown burner number. There was no text attached to the message. It was just a single video file. I pressed play and watched the screen. It was a live video feed broadcasting from across the city. The camera panned slowly across a familiar street before zooming in on my apartment building. Thick black smoke billowed into the night sky. Bright orange flames violently engulfed the windows of my living room. The fire roared with intense ferocity, consuming everything I had ever owned. I stood alone in the dark, watching my entire life burn to the ground. I stared at the bright screen of my phone, completely mesmerized by the sheer destruction unfolding in real time. The flames licked the exterior brick of the building, shattering the glass windows with the intense heat. My furniture, my clothes, my personal documents all turning to ash in the span of a few minutes. They wanted me to see this. They wanted me to understand the absolute severity of the war I had just started. Claire's family was incredibly powerful and incredibly ruthless. They were sending a very clear and unmistakable message. Exposing their financial crimes was only the first move on a very dangerous chessboard. They were fully prepared to burn down my entire world just to maintain their grip on power. I slowly locked the screen of my phone and slid it back into my pocket. My fingers brushed against the small cold brass safety deposit key Mr. Caldwell had given me. I was completely homeless and currently being hunted by a wealthy criminal syndicate. But as I looked out into the dark city, I did not feel an ounce of fear or regret. They had just destroyed my apartment, but they had failed to destroy my spirit. The fire was meant to intimidate me, but it only served to burn away any lingering hesitation I had left. I turned up the collar of my thin blouse against the cold wind and began walking down the dark street. The real fight had only just begun. The small motel room smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap bleach, a stark contrast to the sprawling estate in Buckhead I had fled just hours ago. I sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, my entire body aching from the violent events of the evening. My jaw still throbbed where Andre had struck me, and the cold metal of the safety deposit key felt heavy in my pocket. I had nowhere else to go. My apartment was a smoldering ruin. My family had orchestrated my arrest, and I was now actively hiding from a ruthless real estate conglomerate. But I was not defeated. The fire that consumed my home had only fueled the burning resolve in my chest. I left the motel long before dawn, wrapping a cheap scarf around my neck to hide the bruises. I navigated the empty streets of Atlanta, keeping to the shadows until I reached a discreet 24-hour private vault facility on the outskirts of the city. Mr. Caldwell's whispered instruction echoed in my mind. "Elias said you would know which door this opens." My grandfather had always been a man of precision, and he knew exactly how my mind worked. The key unlocked a small steel box hidden in the lower tiers of the vault. Inside lay a thick manila envelope and a simple silver flash drive. My hands shook slightly as I broke the seal on the envelope. Inside, I found the original notarized copy of Grandpa Elias' true will. It explicitly revoked any previous arrangements and named me as the sole heir to his entire estate and the primary executor of his holding companies. But the will was just the legal armor. The flash drive was the weapon. I hurried back to the motel room, locking the deadbolt and sliding the chain into place. I pulled my cheap burner laptop from my bag and inserted the drive. It was heavily encrypted, but my grandfather had taught me the basics of data encryption before I even entered high school. Within 20 minutes, I bypassed the security protocols and opened the master directory. The screen illuminated the dark room, casting a pale glow across my face as I began to read. What I found was a meticulously organized ledger of absolute devastation. File after file documented the systematic dismantling of my grandfather's legacy and the predatory theft of my community. There were property deeds, loan agreements, and transfer documents. My parents' house in Buckhead, my grandparents' historic estate, the local community center where my grandfather had funded after-school programs for decades. All of them secretly leveraged and signed over to shell companies controlled directly by Montgomery Holdings. I stared at the digital signatures on the transfer documents. They were my signatures, my digital footprints. Andre had not just stolen my identity to open offshore accounts. He had used my credentials to authorize the foreclosure and transfer of the very properties my grandfather had spent his life securing for the community. Betrayal. Absolute betrayal. Betrayal by the brother I had protected my entire life. Betrayal by the mother who stood in the lobby and lied to the police, telling them I was mentally unstable. Betrayal by the father who had always turned a blind eye to my brother's failures. They had actively handed my entire future and the future of our neighborhood over to Claire's family, just to maintain their illusion of wealth. A sudden heavy knock on the motel door shattered the quiet of the room. I slammed the laptop shut and grabbed the heavy brass lamp from the bedside table. The knock came again, louder and more insistent. "Raven, we know you are in there. Open the door." The voice belonged to my father, Desmond. My heart pounded against my ribs. How had they found me so quickly? I slowly approached the door, keeping the lamp raised. I peered through the peephole and saw both my parents standing under the flickering neon light of the motel walkway. My mother looked frantic, her perfectly styled hair now slightly disheveled. My father looked exhausted and desperate. I unlatched the chain and pulled the door open just wide enough to speak, keeping my body blocking the entrance. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice cold and flat. Desmond pushed against the door, forcing it open and stepping into the small room with Patricia close behind. "Raven, please, you have to stop this." My father pleaded, his voice trembling. "You do not understand what you are dealing with. The Montgomerys are too powerful. They will destroy all of us. I looked at the man who had raised me, the man whose approval I had spent my entire life trying to earn. I already know everything, Dad. I know about the shell companies. I know about the forged deeds. I know Andre sold out his own family to buy his way into a country club. My mother's face twisted into a mask of defensive anger. You do not know anything, Raven. Your brother was trying to save us. He was trying to secure our legacy. Secure our legacy by stealing my identity and handing everything over to predators. I shouted, unable to contain the rage any longer. He used my name to authorize the foreclosures. He set me up to take the fall for federal fraud, and you stood in the bank and told the police I was insane. You were willing to let me go to prison to cover for his crimes. My father collapsed onto the edge of the bed, dropping his head into his hands. He did not have to forge your signatures, Raven. Desmond whispered, his voice breaking. I gave him your authorization codes. The confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I stared at my father, the blood draining from my face. You gave him my codes. You knew. Desmond looked up, his eyes filled with tears of shame. I was drowning, Raven. The gambling debts had spiraled completely out of control. I owed people, dangerous people, a massive amount of money. The creditors were threatening to take the house to expose everything. He explained how Andre had approached him with a solution. Claire had offered a massive influx of cash to clear the debts, but the money came with conditions. The Montgomery family required total compliance in their real estate acquisitions, and they demanded a clean fall guy in case the federal authorities started asking questions. Your brother convinced me that you could handle the fallout, Desmond pleaded. He said you were smart enough to navigate the legal system, that you could plea down any charges. We were going to lose everything, Raven. Our status, our home, our entire lives. We had no other choice. Oh, you chose to sacrifice your own daughter to save your social standing. I stated the reality of their actions, hitting me with devastating clarity. You chose to let Claire and her family destroy our community, just so you could keep playing pretend in Buckhead. You chose the golden child over me, just like you always have. My mother stepped forward, her eyes flashing with defiance. We did what we had to do to survive. Your brother has a bright future ahead of him. He has an important marriage. You were always so difficult, so resistant to our guidance. You should have just been compliant and helped the family when we needed you. I looked at my parents, truly seeing them for the first time without the filter of childhood expectation. They were not powerful community leaders. They were weak, pathetic cowards who had sold their souls for the illusion of wealth. I am not compliant anymore. I said, my voice dangerously quiet. I am taking everything back. I am going to destroy Montgomery Holdings, and I am going to make sure Andre answers for every single family he evicted. Now get out of my room before I call the FBI and hand them my father's confession. Patricia grabbed Desmond's arm, pulling him toward the door. You are ruining this family, Raven, she hissed. You are going to get us all killed. As they reached the threshold, Desmond stopped and turned back to face me. His expression was no longer desperate, but deeply terrified. There is something else you need to know, Raven, he said, his voice dropping to an ominous whisper. The hospital called just before we tracked you down. The doctors ran a full toxicology panel on Elias. My grandfather did not just have a sudden heart attack at the dinner table. The report showed massive traces of digitalis in his system. Someone poisoned him. The word poisoned hung in the stagnant air of the cheap motel room like a thick, toxic cloud. Raven stared at her father, watching his weak, trembling hands and his pathetic, tear-stained face. The final piece of the horrifying puzzle locked into place with a sickening snap. It was not just corporate fraud. It was cold-blooded murder. Digitalis was a heart medication, but in high doses it was a lethal and virtually undetectable poison. And only one person at that birthday dinner had the opportunity, the motive, and the absolute lack of human empathy required to slip it into her grandfather's drink. Claire. Claire had sat right beside him, playing the devoted granddaughter-in-law, pouring the wine and serving the food, while wearing her perfectly manufactured smile. Elias had figured it out. Her grandfather had found the hidden ledgers and realized that the Montgomery family was using his own grandson to systematically steal the generational wealth of the Black community. He was going to expose them, and Claire had silenced him permanently right at the dinner table before framing Raven for the entire operation. Raven felt a surge of absolute disgust rise in her throat, so powerful it nearly choked her. She looked at Desmond and Patricia, these two cowards who called themselves her parents. They knew their own son was a criminal. They knew their daughter-in-law was a predator. And now they knew their own father had been murdered. Yet they were standing in a filthy motel room, begging the scapegoat daughter to lay down and take the fall so they could keep their country club memberships and their luxury cars. Raven stepped forward, her posture radiating pure lethal calm. She did not yell. She did not cry. She looked her parents dead in the eyes and told them they were absolutely pathetic. She told them they were dead to her, and that if they did not walk out of that door immediately, she would physically drag them into the parking lot and call the federal agents herself. Patricia tried to reach out a trembling hand, but Raven swatted it away with violent force. She ordered them out and slammed the heavy wooden door behind them, sliding the deadbolt into place with a sharp metallic crack. She was completely alone again, but the fear that had been paralyzing her was entirely gone. It had been incinerated in the fire that destroyed her apartment and washed away by the ultimate betrayal of her parents. All that remained was cold, calculated vengeance. Raven walked back to her small desk and opened her burner laptop. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she accessed the decrypted files from her grandfather's flash drive. She cross-referenced the dates of the stolen property deeds with the social calendar of the Montgomery family. The timeline was completely flawless. Every time a major Black-owned property was foreclosed upon and transferred to a Montgomery shell company, Claire and Andre were hosting a lavish celebration. But there was one event coming up that stood out above all the rest. It was the annual Montgomery Foundation Charity Gala, scheduled for that very weekend at the most exclusive luxury hotel in downtown Atlanta. The hypocrisy of the event was absolutely staggering. The gala was publicly billed as a massive philanthropic effort to invest in underserved minority communities and promote urban development. The Montgomery family was going to stand on a brightly lit stage and accept awards for their incredible generosity, while secretly using fraudulent offshore accounts to evict the very same minority families they claimed to be saving. It was the ultimate performance of the white savior complex, and Raven knew exactly how she was going to tear the entire theater down. For the next 48 hours, Raven did not sleep. She barely ate. She transformed the cramped motel room into a digital command center. Using her elite forensic data skills, she mapped the entire audio-visual network of the downtown luxury hotel. She bypassed their firewalls, routed her connection through 3 international proxy servers, and embedded a sleeper virus directly into the main presentation mainframe of the grand ballroom. She compiled the most damning pieces of evidence from her grandfather's flash drive. The forged signatures, the offshore wire transfers, the internal emails between Claire and her father, explicitly discussing the predatory eviction strategies, and the toxicology reports matching Claire's recent private medical purchases. She linked it all into a single devastating automated presentation. On the evening of the gala, Raven did not hide in the shadows. She used the last of her hidden emergency cash to purchase a stunning floor-length black evening gown. She pulled her hair back into a sleek, elegant style that highlighted her sharp features. The bruises on her jaw were carefully concealed beneath layers of expensive foundation. She forged a digital VIP guest pass using the hotel registry database and walked through the golden front doors of the ballroom looking like she owned the entire building. The room was a glittering sea of extreme wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden light over the hundreds of affluent donors holding delicate champagne flutes. Politicians, judges, corporate executives, and real estate tycoons mingled in their tailored tuxedos and designer dresses. Raven glided silently through the crowd, grabbing a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter. She positioned herself near the back of the room, right next to the massive double doors. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the sickening sound of wealthy people congratulating themselves for their fake morality. Suddenly, the string quartet stopped playing and the lights in the ballroom gracefully dimmed. A spotlight hit the center of the grand stage. Claire walked out to the podium looking like an absolute angel of mercy. She wore a breathtaking white silk gown that clung perfectly to her fragile frame. Andre stood just behind her, playing the role of the quiet, supportive black husband, validating her presence on the stage. Claire gripped the edges of the podium and looked out over the crowd with shimmering, tear-filled eyes. She spoke softly into the microphone, her voice trembling with perfectly practiced emotion. She told the wealthy donors that their city was facing a crisis. She spoke about the tragedy of gentrification and the heartbreaking struggle of minority families losing their homes. She dramatically placed her hand over her heart and declared that the Montgomery Foundation was committing $50 million to buy back these distressed properties and ensure that Black futures were protected. She praised her wonderful husband Andre, calling him a visionary leader who was helping her family bridge the racial divide in the real estate market. The audience erupted into thunderous applause. Women dabbed their eyes with expensive tissues. Men nodded in solemn agreement. It was the most disgusting display of predatory gaslighting Raven had ever witnessed. Claire smiled modestly and gestured toward the massive cinematic screens mounted on the walls behind the stage. She announced that they had prepared a short video to show the beautiful faces of the families the foundation had already saved. The crowd turned their attention to the screens as the hotel audiovisual team hit play. But the heartwarming promotional video did not start. Raven casually reached into her designer clutch and pressed a single button on her burner phone. The sleeper virus instantly hijacked the entire visual system of the grand ballroom. A loud, harsh burst of electronic static echoed through the massive speakers, making the wealthy guests flinch and cover their ears. The screens flashed bright, blinding red before displaying a massive, highly detailed forensic accounting flowchart. The crowd gasped in sudden confusion as high-resolution images of actual foreclosure notices began scrolling rapidly across the screens. Next came the bank records. The screens displayed the exact routing numbers showing millions of dollars being drained from the equity of Black-owned homes and wired directly into the private offshore accounts of Montgomery Holdings. Then the emails appeared. Giant, blown-up screenshots of text messages between Claire and her father. The words were impossible to misinterpret. The messages explicitly detailed their strategy to use Andre's fake company to bypass the Fair Housing Act and acquire the targeted neighborhoods for pennies on the dollar. The final slide was the most devastating. It was a side-by-side comparison of the forged property deeds featuring Andre's fake signature laid directly over the toxicology report showing the lethal dose of digitalis found in grandfather Elias's blood. The words murder and fraud flashed in bold black letters across the bright screens. Total absolute chaos erupted inside the ballroom. The wealthy donors began shouting in panic and confusion. Journalists who had been invited to cover the charity event instantly pulled out their cameras and started recording the screens. Politicians and judges who had accepted bribes from the Montgomery family began rushing toward the exits, desperately trying to escape the blast radius of the scandal. On the stage, Claire's angelic mask completely shattered. Her face turned the color of chalk, and she screamed at the audio-visual technicians to cut the power. Andre stood frozen behind her, his eyes wide with paralyzing terror, as he watched his entire life, his freedom, and his carefully constructed fake reality disintegrating in real time. Raven smiled a cold, satisfied smile and slipped quietly out of the double doors before the panic could fully reach the back of the room. She walked briskly down the carpeted hallway, heading toward the secluded marble restrooms near the lobby. She knew Claire would not stay in the ballroom. Claire was a predator, and predators always tried to isolate themselves when they were exposed. Raven pushed open the heavy oak door of the women's restroom and stood in the center of the luxurious space waiting patiently. Less than a minute later, the door flew open and Claire stormed inside. Her white silk dress was slightly torn at the hem, and her face was contorted into a mask of pure demonic rage. She saw Raven standing calmly by the marble sinks and lunged forward, her manicured hands curled into claws. Raven effortlessly stepped aside and shoved Claire hard against the tiled wall. Claire stumbled, catching her balance by gripping the edge of the granite counter. The sweet Southern Belle routine was entirely gone. Claire bared her teeth and spewed pure venom. She screamed that Raven was nothing but a piece of ghetto trash, a worthless nobody who thought she could disrupt generational wealth. Claire laughed, a harsh manic sound that echoed off the bathroom walls. She told Raven that this little stunt would change absolutely nothing. She bragged that her family owned the judges, they owned the prosecutors, and they owned the city. She said they would simply spin the data, blame the entire fraud on Andre, and walk away completely untouched. Claire stepped closer, her eyes burning with malicious superiority. She sneered and told Raven the pathetic truth about her beloved golden child brother. She whispered that Andre hated his own skin. She said he was so desperate to escape his own identity and be accepted by white high society that he literally begged the Montgomerys to let him into their country club. Claire laughed as she described how easy it was to manipulate him, how quickly he had sold out his own grandfather just to feel like he belonged with the elite. She told Raven that Andre was a weak, pathetic dog who rolled over the second her father offered him a bone. And now, because of Raven's little presentation, Andre was going to take the fall for everything, including the murder of the old man. Claire adjusted her torn silk dress and regained her icy composure. She looked at Raven with absolute disgust and stated that her family would crush Raven so thoroughly that she would wish she had burned to death in her apartment. Claire raised her hand and snapped her fingers. The bathroom door opened, and 3 massive private security contractors in dark suits stepped into the room. They moved with silent military precision, fanning out to block the exit and completely corner Raven against the back wall. The lead guard reached into his jacket, pulling out a heavy set of zip ties. Claire crossed her arms and smiled a cold, triumphant smirk. She told the guards to secure Raven and take her down to the private loading dock. She promised Raven that she was going to disappear tonight, and no one in the world would ever come looking for her. Raven was completely trapped against the cold marble wall, surrounded by 3 massive men who were fully prepared to end her life. But as the guards closed in, ready to grab her arms, Raven did not flinch. She did not fight back or scream for help. Instead, a slow, terrifyingly calm smile spread across her face. She reached into the small pocket of her evening gown and slowly pulled out her phone, holding it up so the bright screen faced Claire. The screen displayed an active live stream graphic with a pulsing red recording dot. Below the dot was a viewer count that was rapidly climbing into the tens of thousands. Raven looked directly into Claire's horrified eyes. Raven explained in a quiet, steady voice that the phone was completely locked and currently broadcasting a live audio stream to the primary servers of every major news outlet, investigative blog, and federal task force in the state of Georgia. Every single word of Claire's venomous, racist rant, every detail about using Andre as a scapegoat, every boast about owning the judges, and every explicit threat to make Raven disappear had just been broadcast live to the entire world. The security guards instantly froze, looking nervously at the glowing phone screen. They were highly paid mercenaries, but they were not going to commit kidnapping and murder on a live federal broadcast. Claire's jaw dropped open, her eyes wide with the sudden, devastating realization that she had just destroyed her own empire. The impenetrable shield of her family wealth had just been shattered by her own arrogant mouth. Raven stepped forward, forcing the massive security guards to part and make way for her. She walked right up to Claire and tilted the phone screen just inches from her pale, trembling face. Raven smiled, her voice echoing loudly into the live microphone. "You just confessed to federal housing discrimination, elder abuse, and attempted murder on a live audio stream broadcasted to every news outlet in Atlanta. Smile for the internet, Claire. The audio leak from the charity gala spread across the internet like a virulent digital plague. Within mere hours of Raven pressing that button, every major news network, investigative blog, and independent journalist in Atlanta had broadcasted Claire's vicious, arrogant rant. The public backlash was absolute and merciless. Claire's carefully crafted image as a philanthropic white savior was completely incinerated in the digital flames of her own racist arrogance. The world finally heard the true voice of the Montgomery Empire, a voice dripping with condescension and dripping with the blood of the minority communities they were actively destroying. But Raven knew from years of working in financial forensics that public outrage was rarely enough to permanently dismantle generational wealth. The Montgomery family immediately deployed their massive army of high-priced defense attorneys and aggressive public relations fixers. They flooded the media with cease and desist letters and spent millions to stall the federal investigations. They buried the local prosecutors in mountains of legal red tape, effectively suppressing the immediate criminal fallout. Money could not buy them public forgiveness, but it was buying them time and keeping them out of federal handcuffs. They were spinning the narrative, desperately trying to paint Claire as a victim of unauthorized surveillance and extreme corporate espionage. The machine of white wealth was working exactly as it was designed to protect its own at all costs. Raven sat in a cracked vinyl booth at a rundown 24-hour diner on the industrial outskirts of the city. The neon sign buzzing violently outside the rain-streaked window cast a harsh, flickering red light across her face. She had traded her stunning designer evening gown for a cheap, oversized hoodie and faded jeans she bought with cash at a local discount store. She sat entirely alone in the quiet diner, nursing a chipped ceramic mug of lukewarm black coffee. She had not slept a single hour since the gala. She was exhausted, her body aching from the physical toll of being hunted and homeless, but her mind was completely sharp and focused. The constant adrenaline pumping through her veins kept her hyper-aware of every shadow and every passing car. She was systematically calculating her next offensive strike against the Montgomery Empire when the dull chime of the bell above the diner door shattered the quiet atmosphere. The smell of stale grease and burned coffee lingered heavily in the air as a new presence entered the room. Raven did not even have to look up from her coffee cup to know exactly who it was. She recognized the heavy, arrogant footsteps approaching her booth. Those were the footsteps of a man who believed the world owed him everything. Andre slid into the vinyl seat directly across from her. He looked absolutely terrible. His expensive custom-tailored suit was deeply wrinkled and stained. The dark bruised circles under his eyes betrayed days of sleepless panic and creeping paranoia. His hands shook slightly as he rested them on the table. But despite his desperate, hunted appearance, his face still held that familiar, infuriating expression of unearned superiority. Raven sat silently waiting for him to speak. A small, naive part of her expected him to be furious at Claire. She expected him to finally realize that he had been played, that his prominent white wife and her powerful family viewed him as nothing more than an expendable human shield. He had heard the audio tape. He knew Claire thought of him as a pathetic dog begging for scraps at her table. Surely the golden child would finally see the absolute betrayal of his own marriage. Surely he would realize that his proximity to white wealth did not make him white. It only made him a target. But as Andre opened his mouth, the sheer, horrifying depth of his delusion became abundantly clear. He did not apologize for setting her up to take the fall for federal fraud. He did not express a single ounce of anger toward Claire for poisoning their grandfather and attempting to murder him for his property. He did not even mention the fact that their parents had lied to the police to protect him. Instead, Andre leaned across the sticky diner table and aimed all of his toxic venom directly at Raven. He told her she was a jealous, bitter loser who could not stand to see him succeed. He spat the words at her with vitriolic hatred, accusing her of completely ruining his one guaranteed chance to break into the billionaire boys' club. Raven listened in quiet disgust as her brother revealed the absolute rot in his soul. He was entirely brainwashed by his proximity to whiteness and extreme wealth. Andre desperately craved the validation of the very people who secretly despised him. He told Raven that the Montgomery family had promised him a seat at the table of absolute power, and that Raven had selfishly ripped it away just to prove a self-righteous point. His self-hatred was so deep, so entirely entrenched in his psyche, that he was perfectly willing to forgive Claire for using him as a criminal scapegoat. He did not care that her family was stealing homes from vulnerable black elders. He did not care that they looked at his skin and saw nothing but a convenient legal loophole to exploit affirmative action quotas. He only cared about the country club memberships, the luxury cars, and the illusion of power. He told Raven that she was exactly what Claire called her, a ghetto trash. Nobody who did not understand how the real world operated. He claimed that the Montgomerys were just playing the game, and he was perfectly happy to play along as long as he got his cut. His absolute refusal to see his own exploitation was staggering. He was a willing participant in his own degradation. He was furious at Raven for turning the lights on and ruining his beautiful, comfortable lie. He wanted to stay in the dark where the money was green and the reality of his existence could be safely ignored. Andre reached inside his ruined suit jacket and pulled out a thick manila folder. He tossed it aggressively onto the table between them, knocking over a plastic salt shaker. He told her the Montgomery family lawyers had worked entirely through the night to draft a highly customized, non-disclosure agreement and settlement contract. He laid out the terms with the arrogant confidence of a man who believed money could magically fix any betrayal and erase any crime. The offer was a flat lump sum of $5 million in untraceable offshore funds. In exchange, Raven had to issue a sworn public statement claiming the entire audio stream from the gala was an AI deepfake created by a disgruntled former employee. She had to publicly clear Claire's name, retract all accusations of housing discrimination, and legally sign over the executive rights to Grandpa's offshore escrow accounts back to the Montgomery shell companies. She was expected to take the entire blame for the data breach and vanish into obscurity, while Andre and his corporate masters continued to bleed the city dry. Andre leaned back in the vinyl booth, crossing his arms over his chest. He promised that if she signed the contract right now, he would personally buy her a beautiful house anywhere in the country and ensure the Montgomerys left her alone forever. He told her she could take the money and start over far away from Atlanta. He looked at her with condescending pity and told her it was the best deal she was ever going to get. He said the Montgomerys were giving her a golden parachute and that she would be completely insane to refuse the offer. He pulled an expensive silver pen from his pocket and placed it deliberately on top of the manila folder, tapping it twice with his manicured finger. He sat there waiting for her to break. He waited for her to do what she had always done throughout their entire childhood, sacrifice herself so he could thrive. Raven stared at the thick stack of legal documents resting next to her coffee cup. The sheer audacity of the offer made a fresh wave of nausea rise in her throat. Her entire life she had been expected to shrink herself to make her brother comfortable. She had been trained by her parents to swallow her pride, absorb his failures, and accept whatever miserable scraps they decided to offer her. They had expected her to empty her savings for his mistakes, to bleed so he could shine, and to ultimately sacrifice her freedom so he could inherit an empire of stolen wealth. They thought she was weak. They thought her silence was submission. And now he was sitting across from her, demanding that she sell her soul to the very people who tried to destroy her. She looked at the glossy pages of the contract detailing the exact price tag they had placed on her integrity. $5 million to disappear. $5 million to erase her grandfather's murder. $5 million to watch her community be gentrified and destroyed. $5 million to remain the obedient, silent scapegoat. The woman sitting in this rundown diner was no longer the quiet sister they could manipulate and control. The obedient scapegoat had died in the flames of her burning apartment. The terrified girl running through the shattered glass doors of her family home was gone forever. Raven looked up from the folder and locked eyes with her brother. Andre smiled a smug, highly satisfied smile, clearly believing he had won the war. He thought she was finally surrendering to the overwhelming power of the Montgomery checkbook just like he had. He saw her hand reach out and assumed she was reaching for the silver pen to sign her life away. He thought the power dynamics of their toxic family were finally being restored to their proper alignment. But Raven did not touch the pen. She gripped the thick stack of legal contracts in both hands. She held his gaze without blinking, her face an unreadable mask of absolute resolution. Slowly and deliberately, she violently ripped the entire stack of documents in half, tearing right through the customized non-disclosure agreement. The thick sound of tearing paper cut through the ambient noise of the diner. Andre's smug smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, uncomprehending shock. His jaw dropped open as he watched the pieces of his $5 million lifeline flutter to the sticky table. Before he could even register what was happening or open his mouth to protest, Raven picked up her heavy ceramic mug and threw the lukewarm black coffee directly into his face. Andre gasped loudly and lunged backward in the booth, wildly slapping his hands against his wet, stinging eyes. The dark coffee dripped down his face and ruined his expensive white shirt, soaking into the fabric and staining it a dirty brown. He sputtered and cursed blindly, trying to wipe the liquid away. The few other patrons sitting in the diner turned to stare in shock, but Raven did not care. She planted her hands firmly on the sticky table and leaned her entire body forward, bridging the gap between them. She grabbed her brother by the soaked collar of his suit jacket and pulled him forcefully forward so he could not escape her voice. Her grip was unyielding, her knuckles turning white with the force of her anger. Her tone was lethal and absolutely terrifying in its quiet, calm certainty. She did not scream, but the absolute promise of his destruction echoed in every single syllable. She wanted him to feel the exact weight of the consequences crashing down on his head. "I checked the hospital registry, Andre." Raven whispered directly into his ear, ensuring every word pierced through his arrogant delusion like a poisoned dagger. "Grandpa Elias just woke up from his coma, and he is talking to the FBI." Andre's face dropped in sheer terror. The remaining color instantly drained from his skin, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost, trapped in a ruined suit. His eyes widened in absolute horror as the reality of her words washed over him. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The illusion of his safety, his wealth, and his golden boy immunity was completely shattered. The FBI was not going to offer him a non-disclosure agreement. The federal authorities were not going to buy him a house in exchange for his silence. He was going to prison. Raven let go of his collar, letting him slump back into the vinyl seat. She turned around and walked out of the diner into the pouring rain, leaving him completely alone to face the absolute certainty of his own destruction. I left the cracked vinyl booth of the diner behind me and walked out into the freezing Atlanta rain. My mind was racing far faster than my heartbeat as the cold water soaked through my thin cotton hoodie. Andre was a coward, but I knew from years of studying human behavior that a desperate, panicked coward was the most dangerous kind of animal in the world. My brother knew that Grandpa Elias had just woken up from his coma. He knew the old man was currently sitting in a hospital bed talking to federal agents. Claire and the massive Montgomery family would never just sit back and watch their billion-dollar real estate empire crumble into dust. They would try to silence the only credible witness who could tie them directly to the lethal poisoning and the massive housing fraud. I had to get to Atlanta Memorial Hospital before their assassins did. I pulled my hood up against the biting wind and ran full speed toward the nearest subway station. I knew the exact layout of the hospital from the countless times I used to visit my grandfather during his routine medical checkups. He was secured in the private VIP ward on the top floor of the North Tower. I had to move incredibly fast and remain completely invisible. It took me 40 agonizing minutes to navigate the late-night public transit system and reach the towering glass and steel facade of the medical center. My clothes were completely saturated and heavy with rain, My shoes squeaked softly against the polished linoleum floor of the main reception lobby. I kept my head down and bypassed the brightly lit main security desk, sneaking down a side corridor to reach the service elevator. When the heavy metal doors finally slid open on the top floor, I crept down the sterile white hallway, keeping my back pressed flat against the cool plaster wall. I ducked behind a heavy stainless steel supply cart and peered cautiously around the corner. Just 50 feet away, a pair of federal agents in dark tailored suits stood guarding the entrance to the VIP suite, and standing directly in front of those armed federal officers was my own mother. Patricia was wearing a pristine camel hair coat, looking completely dry and perfectly composed, despite the chaotic nightmare unfolding across the city. She was actively arguing with the federal agents, and her tone was dripping with manufactured maternal concern. Her voice was low, but the hallway was quiet enough for me to hear every single venomous word. She was telling the federal officers that Elias was a senile, delusional old man who was suffering from severe advanced dementia. She was begging the agents to leave his room immediately, claiming that his mind was completely gone, and that any wild statements he made about being poisoned were just the paranoid hallucinations of a dying brain. My stomach twisted with absolute sickening revulsion. My own mother was actively running interference for the exact same people who had tried to murder her father-in-law in cold blood. She was protecting the wealthy white predators who wanted her family dead just so she could maintain her access to the country club and her shallow luxury lifestyle. I could not just walk up and confront her in the open. The federal agents would detain me immediately, considering the false grand larceny and assault charges my family had formally filed against me at the bank earlier that week. I needed a massive distraction. My forensic analyst brain quickly scanned the immediate environment, calculating the variables. Directly above the supply cart I was hiding behind was a sensitive commercial fire alarm pull station. Resting on the bottom shelf of the cart was a heavy aerosol can of industrial disinfectant spray. I grabbed the metal can and depressed the nozzle, spraying a thick, concentrated cloud of chemical mist directly up into the smoke detector mounted on the ceiling. 10 seconds later, the deafening shriek of the hospital fire alarm violently shattered the quiet ward. Emergency strobe lights began flashing blinding white pulses across the long hallway. The heavy automated fire doors at the end of the corridor began to slide shut. The two federal agents instantly drew their weapons and stepped away from the door, moving rapidly down the hall to secure the perimeter and investigate the source of the sudden alarm. Patricia cursed loudly under her breath and stepped into an adjacent empty waiting room to avoid the piercing noise and the flashing lights. The path to the room was completely clear. I sprinted down the hallway and slipped silently into my grandfather's private hospital room. The heavy, solid oak door clicked shut behind me, instantly muffling the blaring alarm outside. The room was bathed in the soft, rhythmic blue glow of various medical monitors. Grandfather Elias lay perfectly still in the center of the large mechanical hospital bed. He looked incredibly frail and exhausted, his dark skin pale against the stark white hospital sheets. A clear plastic oxygen tube rested gently beneath his nose, and multiple intravenous lines fed directly into his bruised forearms. But when he slowly turned his head and looked at me, his dark eyes were completely clear and intensely sharp. He did not have dementia. He possessed the razor-sharp clarity of a seasoned patriarch who finally saw the absolute horrifying truth about his own corrupted bloodline. "Raven," he whispered, his voice raspy and terribly weak. "You came." I rushed to the side of his bed and took his cold, frail hand in both of mine. I leaned in close and told him that I had successfully found the hidden offshore ledgers. I told him that the entire city now knew exactly what Claire and Andre had done to the black homeowners in our community. A faint, proud smile touched his dry lips. He reached under his thin hospital pillow with a trembling, determined hand. He pulled out a small, heavy black thumb drive attached to a long silver chain and pressed it firmly into my palm. His fingers closed tightly over mine. He told me that the encrypted drive contained the master access keys to his original trust fund and all of his massive legitimate assets. He explained in a breathless whisper that he had secretly moved the bulk of his liquid wealth completely out of the country before Andre and Claire could drain his accounts. He looked deep into my eyes and told me that I was the only person in the entire family with the strength and the unyielding integrity to rebuild what they had maliciously destroyed. He said I was the only true heir to the bloodline. He told me to take the drive and use every single penny to buy back every single house the Montgomery family had stolen. Before I could even slip the silver chain over my head, the heavy wooden door of the hospital room burst violently open. The blinding flash of the hallway strobe light spilled into the dark room, revealing my mother standing in the doorway. Patricia stared at me with absolute sheer disbelief that quickly morphed into pure, unhinged, demonic rage. Her eyes darted frantically from my bruised face to the black thumb drive clutched tightly in my hand. She slammed the door behind her, shutting out the alarm, and marched aggressively toward the hospital bed. She completely ignored my presence and leaned threateningly over her frail, dying father-in-law. She screamed at Elias, her voice dripping with decades of suppressed, bitter resentment. She demanded to know why he had never trusted Andre. She yelled that her son was a brilliant, ambitious visionary and that Elias had always held him back just to punish her for not coming from old money. She blamed the old man entirely for forcing Andre to seek validation and funding from the wealthy Montgomery family. Grandfather Elias did not flinch away from her screaming face. He looked up at the woman who had raised his grandchildren and spoke with a quiet, devastating, absolute authority. He told Patricia that she had ruined her own son. He weakly but sternly told her that she had completely destroyed the boy by shielding him from every single consequence of his actions since he was a child. He said she had constantly fed Andre's massive arrogance until it became a lethal toxic poison that infected and killed the entire family. He pointed a trembling, frail finger at her and stated that she was the sole reason her son was a pathetic coward and a federal criminal. He told her she had chosen a luxury zip code over her own daughter's life and that she was nothing but a parasite. The brutal, honest truth hit Patricia like a physical sledgehammer. Her face twisted into a grotesque mask of pure, desperate hatred. She realized in that exact moment that if Elias survived the night, he would testify to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and her entire world of wealth and country club privilege would evaporate into long federal prison sentences. She looked frantically at the life support monitor, tracking his erratic heartbeat. She reached out her hand, curling her manicured fingers into a tight, rigid claw, and grabbed the thick bundle of medical wires connecting his heart monitor and oxygen supply to the wall. She was actually going to unplug the machines. She was going to murder her own father-in-law in a hospital bed just to protect her precious golden boy from facing justice. Pure raw instinct and explosive adrenaline took over my entire body. I dropped the silver chain and lunged violently across the hospital bed. I tackled my own mother, driving my shoulder hard and fast, directly into her chest before she could rip the life support cables from the wall socket. We crashed violently onto the hard, cold linoleum floor. Patricia shrieked and flailed wildly like a cornered beast, her manicured nails scratching deeply into the side of my neck and tearing at my cheek. I pinned her arms to the ground, using my entire body weight to hold her thrashing form down. I looked down into the face of the woman who gave birth to me and saw absolutely nothing but a desperate, ruthless monster willing to kill a helpless old man to keep her luxury cars. We struggled brutally on the cold floor, the sound of our heavy, panicked breathing mixing with the steady, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor that remained safely plugged into the wall. Heavy boots pounded loudly down the hallway outside. The hospital room door swung completely open, and 3 armed hospital security guards rushed inside. They immediately grabbed my shoulders and pulled me forcefully off my mother, pinning my arms roughly behind my back. Patricia scrambled frantically to her feet, smoothing the front of her expensive cashmere coat, and instantly bursting into loud theatrical sobs. She played the fragile, traumatized victim flawlessly, crying out in fake terror that I had violently attacked her without warning. She pointed her shaking finger directly at my face and wailed to the security guards that I was the violent, unstable sociopath who had poisoned Elias at the dinner table. She screamed that I had broken into the room trying to finish the job and murder him. She demanded that they arrest me immediately and lock me away forever. The security guards looked at me with deep hostile suspicion, gripping my arms even tighter as I stood there bleeding and breathing heavily. But before they could drag me out into the hallway, a tall, imposing man in a dark federal suit walked calmly through the open doorway. It was the lead federal agent I had seen earlier standing guard outside. His face was entirely grim-solid and thoroughly professional. He was holding a thick stack of official legal documents in his right hand. He walked straight past the security guards and completely ignored Patricia's loud, hysterical performance. He walked right up to my mother and held up a federal warrant signed in fresh black ink by a federal judge. He looked Patricia dead in the eyes, and his deep voice silenced the entire room. He told her she was under arrest for accessory to attempted murder and federal conspiracy. He calmly explained that his cyber division had just recovered the deleted encrypted text messages between her and Claire explicitly discussing the exact dosage of digitalis required to stop a human heart. Patricia stopped crying instantly. Her fake sobs died in her throat. The warm color drained completely from her face, leaving her looking like a hollow, empty shell of a human being. The federal agent signaled to the security guards to release me, and they quickly let go of my arms, stepping backward in stunned silence. Another federal agent walked briskly into the room, holding a pair of heavy metal handcuffs. Patricia began to scream uncontrollably as the cold, heavy steel locked securely around her wrists. She thrashed wildly against the agent, screaming for Andre at the top of her lungs. She begged her precious golden boy to come and save her. She wailed his name over and over again as the federal agents dragged her out of the hospital room and down the long, flashing, sterile hallway. But her desperate cries echoed uselessly into the empty night. Andre was completely gone. The golden boy was nowhere to be found. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles painted the wet hospital parking lot as I walked out into the freezing rain, leaving the wreckage of my mother behind me. Patricia was gone, and the entire Montgomery Empire was currently scrambling to protect itself from the massive federal probe. But there was one loose end that desperately needed to be tied. Andre. The golden boy had completely vanished into the night, but I knew he could not hide for long. The Montgomery family had absolutely no use for a liability. Within an hour of the gala disaster, Claire and her father had completely severed him from their vast network. They froze every single joint bank account. They locked his access to the estate, and they canceled his private credit cards. He was utterly useless to them now, a burned asset floating in the wind with federal agents closing in on all sides. But Andre was not a survivor. He had never spent a single day of his life without a safety net, and I knew exactly how a desperate, cornered coward operated. I sat in the driver's seat of my rented car, the heater blasting against my soaked clothes, and opened my laptop. I did not need federal resources to find my brother. I knew his digital habits better than he did. He had undoubtedly dropped his primary phone to avoid federal tracking, but a man like Andre always kept a secondary line, a burner phone for his illicit offshore dealings. I ran a localized trace algorithm scanning the cellular towers around the greater Atlanta area, looking for the specific encrypted ping associated with his offshore proxy. It took less than 20 minutes for the signal to bounce back. The location illuminated as a glowing red dot on my digital map, and a bitter knowing laugh escaped my lips. He had run back to the exact place where our family's toxic legacy of failure had first begun. The signal was pinging from a massive dilapidated industrial park on the south side of the city. It was the exact same rusted, decaying warehouse where our father Desmond had started his very first failed logistics company decades ago. The place where Desmond had first learned to cut corners and cheat his own people. It was fitting that the son would return to the monument of the father's ultimate failure. I drove through the dark, slick streets of Atlanta, the relentless rain pounding against the windshield. The industrial park was entirely abandoned, a wasteland of shattered windows and collapsing concrete structures. I parked my car 2 blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, moving silently through the deep shadows. The massive corrugated metal doors of the old warehouse were rusted shut, but I knew about the side entrance, the small loading door hidden behind overgrown weeds. I slipped inside the massive cavernous building. The air was thick with the suffocating smell of mildew, rotting wood, and decades of undisturbed dust. The only light came from a single weak emergency bulb flickering near the center of the massive room. And sitting directly under that pale yellow light on a broken wooden shipping crate was Andre. He looked absolutely pathetic. The handsome, arrogant executive who had stood on the gala stage just hours ago was completely gone. His expensive, custom-tailored suit was soaked and stained with mud. He was shivering violently, rubbing his hands together and pacing back and forth like a trapped rat. When he heard my footsteps echoing against the concrete floor, he spun around, his eyes wide with pure, sheer panic. "Raven!" he gasped, his voice cracking with desperate relief. "You came!" He stumbled toward me, nearly tripping over his own expensive leather shoes. He looked at me, not with the superiority he had shown at the diner, but with the pathetic, pleading eyes of a begging child. "Raven, you have to help me," he stammered, grabbing at my wet sleeves. "The Montgomerys completely cut me off. My cards are declining. Claire will not answer my calls. The feds are going to arrest me, Raven. They are going to put all of it on me. You have the access codes now. Grandpa gave you everything." "I know he did. I just need a little bit of cash, Raven. Just give me the $200,000 check from his emergency fund so I can get across the border. I can get to Mexico tonight. You can save me." I stood perfectly still, letting his frantic, pathetic words wash over me. He was completely oblivious to the gravity of what he had done. He actually believed I would fund his escape. I looked at this man, the golden child who had been handed the entire world on a silver platter, and watched him desperately trying to construct a narrative where he was the innocent victim. "It is not my fault, Raven," he cried, his voice rising in high-pitched panic. "You have to understand the pressure I was under. Claire manipulated me. Her father forced my hand. They used me because I am a black man in their white world. It is systemic, Raven. It is the racist system. They needed a black face to put on the foreclosures to bypass the federal housing regulations, and they targeted me. I was a victim of their white supremacy. Mom and Dad put so much pressure on me to succeed, and the Montgomerys just took advantage of my ambition. I did not want to hurt our people. I did not want to hurt those families. I was trapped, you have to believe me. I felt a cold, absolute zero calm settle deep into my bones. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the thick stack of printed data logs I had compiled from his own encrypted servers. I slapped the heavy stack of papers forcefully against his chest, making him flinch backward in terror. I did not yell. I spoke with a quiet, terrifying precision that echoed loudly in the empty warehouse. "Stop lying to me and stop lying to yourself, Andre." I said, my voice sharp as broken glass. I read the logs. I traced every single digital signature, every offshore wire transfer, and every internal corporate email. Claire did not force you to do anything. Her father did not manipulate you into targeting our community. You volunteered. I stepped closer, forcing him to back up against the broken wooden crate. "You are not a victim of systemic racism." "Andre," I continued, my eyes locked onto his terrified face. "You actively weaponized your own identity for profit. The data logs explicitly show that you initiated the predatory loan structures. You drafted the aggressive eviction notices for the elderly black residents in our neighborhood. You specifically selected those properties because you knew exactly how vulnerable they were, and you knew exactly how to exploit their lack of legal resources. You sold out your own people to buy a seat at a table where they secretly laughed at you. You approved the foreclosures on the very same community center where Grandpa Elias used to take us when we were children. You did not do it because you were trapped. You did it because you wanted the luxury cars, the country club status, and the approval of wealthy white predators who only saw you as a convenient disposable tool. He shook his head frantically, tears mixing with the rainwater on his face. No, Raven, that is not true, he pleaded, backing away. I am your brother. We are family. You have to give me the check. You cannot just let me rot in federal prison. He is no victim. I thought, looking at his trembling, pathetic form. The realization was absolute and final. He is a predator who stole from his own, a predator who hit his sister, a predator who let his white wife poison his grandfather. I stepped forward, invading his personal space, and looked at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. You stood in that bank and watched me get arrested for your crimes, I whispered harshly. You let Mom and Dad lie to the federal agents, claiming I was mentally unstable. You hit me across the face when I confronted you about stealing my identity. And tonight you stood on that brightly lit stage, holding the hand of the exact same woman who poured lethal digitalis into our grandfather's drink. You knew Elias was murdered, and you stayed silent because the blood money was too good to give up. I am not giving you a single dime, Andre. I'm going to stand right here and watch the federal agents drag you away in chains, just like they dragged our mother out of that hospital tonight. Andre stared at me, the desperate, pleading expression slowly melting off his face. The pathetic, terrified boy vanished, and the cold, calculated survivalist returned. His tears stopped instantly. His trembling ceased. He stood up straighter, wiping the rainwater from his ruined suit jacket. A slow, dark, sickeningly familiar smile crept across his bruised face. You always were too smart for your own good. Raven, he said, his voice suddenly flat and completely devoid of emotion. You just never understood how to play the game. Before I could even process the sudden chilling shift in his demeanor, a heavy metallic screech echoed through the cavernous space. The massive rusted corrugated metal doors at the far end of the warehouse suddenly began to slide open on their grinding tracks. The blinding white beams of heavy tactical flashlights instantly pierced through the darkness, sweeping across the dusty concrete floor and locking directly onto my face. I threw my arm up to shield my eyes from the blinding glare. The heavy, synchronized sound of combat boots echoed loudly into the building. 4 massive men dressed entirely in black tactical gear stepped out of the shadows and into the pale yellow light. They were heavily armed, moving with the precise, coordinated lethality of elite private military contractors. Claire's private fixers. The same men who had tried to corner me in the hotel bathroom. My heart slammed against my ribs as the horrifying reality of the situation crashed down on me. The burner phone trace. The pathetic location at our father's old warehouse. The desperate pleading for the emergency check. It was all a meticulously constructed performance. Andre had not run here to hide from the Montgomery family. He had run here to orchestrate a trade. He knew I would trace his digital footprint. He knew my forensic skills would lead me exactly to this location. He had deliberately left the breadcrumbs and used his burner phone to lure me into an isolated, abandoned industrial park where no one would hear a gunshot. He sold me out. He had contacted Claire the absolute second he realized the federal agents were closing in and offered her the one thing she wanted more than anything else in the world. Me. The girl who had humiliated her, who had exposed her fake empire, and who held the master key to grandfather's remaining fortune. Andre was trading his own sister's life to buy his way back into Claire's good graces. He was handing me over to her heavily armed assassins, hoping that eliminating the primary witness would earn him a pardon from the Montgomery family and restore his billionaire lifestyle. Well done, Andre! A deep, raspy voice called out from the darkness behind the blinding flashlights. The lead fixer stepped forward, raising a suppressed handgun and aiming the laser sight directly at my chest. You delivered her exactly as promised. The boss will be extremely pleased that you chose loyalty over blood. Andre stepped away from me, moving safely behind the armed men. He did not look back. He did not show a single ounce of remorse. He just stood there, staring at the concrete floor, waiting for them to erase his final mistake. I was completely surrounded, trapped in an abandoned warehouse with 4 armed killers and the brother who had just signed my death warrant. The red dot of the laser sight rested directly over my heart, and the heavy metal doors slammed completely shut, sealing us inside the darkness. The lead fixer stepped forward and violently disarmed me, kicking my burner phone across the concrete floor. Andre stepped out from the shadows, moving safely behind the wall of armed mercenaries. He looked at me with a pathetic, hollow expression and muttered that he was sorry, but it was just business. The sound of a heavy vehicle engine echoed into the warehouse. A sleek, black luxury SUV slowly rolled through the secondary loading bay doors. The vehicle stopped, and the rear door swung open. Claire stepped out onto the filthy concrete floor wearing pristine designer clothes and looking at me as if I was a disgusting piece of dirt, stuck to the bottom of her expensive shoes. She smiled her cold, predatory smile and instructed the fixers to kill me quickly and scatter my body parts across the city to make it look like a low-level drug deal gone violently wrong. I was completely disarmed, surrounded by trained killers and facing the woman who had poisoned my grandfather. But I did not fall to my knees. I did not beg for my life. Instead, a slow, dark, genuinely amused smile spread across my face. I casually looked down at my watch, checking the time. I looked back up at Claire and asked her a simple question. I asked if she honestly believed that a senior financial forensic analyst working for the federal government would ever walk into a blind, isolated location without a dead man switch. Claire scoffed loudly, crossing her arms over her designer jacket and calling it a pathetic, desperate bluff. She told the guards to stop wasting time and pull the trigger. But I did not flinch. I calmly told Claire that the $200,000 check Grandpa Elias had given me was not just a piece of paper. Elias knew the family was corrupt. He knew he was being monitored. So he had deliberately embedded a microscopic RFID tracking chip directly into the fiber of the check. And because I had slipped that check securely inside my shoe before breaking out of the dining room, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had been tracking my exact geographical location in real time for the last 48 hours. Andre let out a sharp, terrified gasp. But Claire rolled her eyes, refusing to believe her perfect plan was collapsing. She yelled at the fixers to shoot me. I calmly raised my hand and pointed toward the ceiling. I told Claire to look at the commercial sprinkler system mounted above our heads. A small, brilliant red light was flashing rapidly in the darkness. I explained that I had completely hacked the warehouse's electrical grid 10 minutes before entering and synced it directly to the FBI tactical server. That flashing red light was not a fire alarm. It was a federal lock signifying that the building was entirely surrounded. Claire looked up in the flashing red light, and the smug, arrogant confidence instantly melted off her face. She opened her mouth to scream an order, but before a single sound could escape her lips, the screech of heavy tires and the deafening wail of emergency sirens erupted from every single direction outside the building. The heavy metal doors of the warehouse did not just open, they were violently blown off their rusted tracks by explosive breaching charges. Deafening sirens shattered the quiet, abandoned industrial park as blinding blue and red strobe lights flooded the dark, cavernous space. Dozens of heavily armed federal SWAT agents swarmed into the building, tactical boots pounding against the cracked concrete as laser sights sliced through the thick, dusty air. "Drop your weapons! Get on the ground!" The tactical team screamed, their voices echoing aggressively off the corrugated metal walls. They swarmed the private fixers before the highly paid mercenaries could even process the devastating reality of the live stream broadcast. The elite killers immediately dropped their suppressed handguns and sank to their knees, realizing instantly that they had walked directly into a massive, inescapable federal trap. Claire's arrogant, beautiful mask completely dissolved into pure, raw animal panic. The pristine, untouchable heiress suddenly understood that her generational family wealth meant absolutely nothing in this dark, dirty room. She turned on her expensive designer heels and made a desperate, pathetic dash toward the side exit, abandoning my brother and her own security team without a single second thought. I did not even have to try. I casually stuck my foot out and sent her crashing face first onto the filthy wet concrete floor. She shrieked in pain and ultimate humiliation, her pristine white silk evening gown soaking up the thick black oil and mud from the ground. I knelt beside her, pressing my knee firmly between her shoulder blades, pinning the wealthy predator flat to the dirt. "Welcome to the real world, Claire," I whispered smoothly as the federal agents yanked her arms behind her back and slapped heavy, cold steel handcuffs over her delicate wrists. The aftermath of the warehouse raid was swift, brutal, and absolutely complete. The live audio stream I had broadcasted directly to the media, combined with the massive cache of encrypted data I handed over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, acted as an inescapable death sentence for the entire Montgomery Empire. By sunrise, federal tactical teams and IRS agents were simultaneously raiding the massive Montgomery estate in the wealthy suburbs of Buckhead, hauling out boxes of physical hard drives, hidden offshore ledgers, and highly encrypted private servers. The national news networks completely abandoned their regular morning programming to cover what was quickly being dubbed the financial and social scandal of the entire decade. Every major news channel, radio station, and digital blog was broadcasting the exact same horrifying story across the country. A powerful, seemingly untouchable white billionaire family had deliberately used a desperate, approval-starved black golden child as their primary front to systematically steal generational wealth from vulnerable black neighborhoods. Andre was plastered across every television screen and news site in the nation, not as the brilliant young visionary business leader he had always pretended to be, but as the ultimate pathetic pawn in a deeply racist, predatory scheme. His face was completely devoid of life, his shoulders slumped in total absolute defeat as the media cameras captured him being paraded into the downtown federal courthouse, wearing a bright orange jumpsuit and heavy iron chains. The entire criminal enterprise that had terrorized and displaced our community for years was completely dismantled and burned to the ground in less than 48 hours. The vast Montgomery family assets were seized by the government, their countless bank accounts were frozen, and Claire's father was arrested by armed agents while frantically attempting to board a private jet to a non-extradition country. But there was still one final piece of my own rotting family tree that desperately needed to be pruned before I could finally walk away. I stood quietly in the cold, sterile observation hallway of the Federal Detention Center, watching my father pace nervously inside a bleak, concrete interrogation room. Desmond looked like a hollowed-out empty shell of the imposing, wealthy patriarch he had once pretended to be. His expensive, custom-tailored suit was completely wrinkled and stained with sweat. His silver hair was unkempt and patchy, and his hands shook violently every single time he turned a corner in the small, windowless room. The federal prosecutor had granted me exactly 15 minutes alone with him before they began their official, aggressive questioning regarding his direct complicity in my grandfather's attempted murder and the massive financial fraud scheme he had helped facilitate for the Montgomerys. I pushed the heavy metal door open, and the solid lock clicked shut behind me, sealing us inside. Desmond stopped pacing instantly and stared at me with wide, bloodshot, terrified eyes. He immediately collapsed into the hard metal chair across the steel table and began to weep into his hands. It was a pathetic, disgusting display of manufactured grief designed entirely to manipulate my emotions and force me back into my lifelong role as the family caretaker. "Raven, please," he begged, his voice cracking as heavy tears streamed down his weathered face and dripped onto his ruined suit collar. "You have to tell the agents that I did not know how bad it truly was. You have to tell them Claire and her powerful father manipulated your brother, and that I was just trying to protect our family business and keep us afloat. I am your father, Raven. I gave you life. You cannot just let them lock me away in a maximum security federal prison for the rest of my days. I raised you from a little girl. I provided a roof over your head and food on your table. You have to show me some mercy right now because family takes care of family." I stood completely still, letting his pathetic, desperate lies wash over me without feeling a single ounce of sympathy or hesitation. He was doing exactly what my mother had done in the hospital hallway, and exactly what my brother had done in the abandoned warehouse. He was playing the ultimate victim and demanding that the scapegoat daughter he had abused, neglected and discarded magically, save him from the devastating consequences of his own boundless greed. I looked at the man who had constantly told me I was a bitter failure, and I felt absolutely nothing but cold surgical precision. I reached into the inside pocket of my dark coat and pulled out a single crisp manila folder. I did not yell at him. I did not scream about the past or the trauma he had inflicted on my childhood. I simply dropped the heavy folder onto the cold steel table and slid it slowly across the metal surface until it bumped gently against his trembling hands. "Open it," I commanded, my voice completely flat and entirely devoid of any human warmth. Desmond wiped his running nose with the back of his dirty sleeve and opened the folder with violently shaking fingers. His bloodshot eyes scanned the heavy legal document inside, and the very last remaining color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. It was the master property deed to the massive suburban house he and Patricia had cherished far more than they had ever cherished their own daughter. The sprawling luxury estate they had purchased using the stolen trust funds and the illicit kickbacks from the Montgomery family foreclosures. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing in silent, suffocating horror, unable to process what he was holding. The bank legally foreclosed on the property at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. I explained, my tone matching the sterile chill of the concrete interrogation room. The federal government froze all of your illicit offshore assets last night, and the bank immediately seized the property to cover the defaulted, fraudulent loans you took out to maintain your fake lifestyle. And because I am now the sole legal executor of grandfather Elias' legitimate multi-million-dollar trust fund, I bought the estate straight from the bank, paid entirely in cash. Desmond stared at me, completely paralyzed by the absolute finality of my words. He could not breathe. He could not speak. The power dynamic that had defined our entire lives had completely inverted in the span of a single calm sentence. She owns the house. She owns the legacy. She owns the future. The scapegoat now holds the leash. You have absolutely nothing left. Desmond, I said, leaning forward and staring directly into his hollow, broken eyes, ensuring he heard every single syllable. Your precious golden boy is going to a federal penitentiary for decades to take the fall for a family that never even respected him. Your wife is currently facing multiple life sentences for conspiracy to commit capital murder against her own father-in-law. Your fraudulent logistics business is nothing but digital ash. And the massive luxury house you prized above my very existence legally belongs to the daughter you threw away like useless trash. Desmond began to hyperventilate, his chest heaving erratically as the massive, crushing walls of his new reality finally collapsed onto him, burying his ego forever. "But where am I supposed to go?" he sobbed openly, weeping like a terrified, abandoned child, clutching the table for support. "Where am I supposed to live when they let me out of here? Raven, you cannot leave me out on the street." I smiled, a slow, dark, absolute smile that did not reach my cold eyes. I reached into my pocket one final time and pulled out a glossy, brightly colored folded brochure. I slid it deliberately across the cold metal table, stopping it right on top of the certified property deed. It was a promotional pamphlet for the run-down, decaying, low-income housing facility on the far industrial south side of the city. The exact same roach-infested, crime-ridden, crumbling facility that Desmond and Andre had forcefully relocated dozens of evicted black families into after stealing their homes. "Enjoy your new neighborhood, Dad." I walked out of the federal detention center and left my father sitting alone in the cold, sterile interrogation room. I did not look back. The heavy steel doors clicked shut behind me, sealing away the toxic legacy of my past forever. The next 6 months passed in an absolute blur of endless federal hearings, endless legal depositions, and relentless media coverage. The entire city of Atlanta was completely captivated by the dramatic fall of the Montgomery Empire. The news networks ran special segments every single night, detailing how a powerful, untouchable white family had used a desperate, approval-starved black golden child as their primary front for a massive predatory real estate theft. It became the absolute scandal of the decade. The courtroom was packed to absolute capacity on the morning the final verdicts were handed down. I sat in the front row wearing a sharp, tailored suit, feeling completely calm as the federal judge took his seat at the high mahogany bench. Claire Montgomery was brought into the courtroom first. The glamorous, untouchable heiress who had once ruled Atlanta high society was completely gone. She looked incredibly pale and dangerously thin, wearing a standard-issue orange prison jumpsuit instead of her usual designer silk gowns. Her expensive blonde hair was dull and lifeless. She stood before the judge trembling visibly as he read the devastating list of her crimes. The evidence against her was absolutely overwhelming and completely irrefutable. The judge looked down at her with pure, unadulterated disgust and sentenced her to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole for attempted capital murder and massive federal wire fraud. Claire did not maintain her icy composure. She completely broke down. She began screaming hysterically, thrashing against the federal marshals as they grabbed her arms and dragged her forcefully out of the courtroom. She wailed for her father, begging for someone to save her, but her father was already serving his own lengthy sentence in another facility. Her desperate cries echoed down the marble hallway until the heavy wooden doors slammed shut, silencing her forever. Andre was brought in next. My golden boy brother looked entirely broken. His arrogant posture had completely collapsed, leaving him looking like a terrified, hollow little boy. He kept his head bowed, staring fixedly at the floor as the judge listed his countless crimes against our own community. The judge condemned him for weaponizing his own identity to exploit and destroy vulnerable families who had trusted him. Andre was sentenced to 15 solid years in federal prison for aggravated racketeering and corporate conspiracy. As the guards moved in to take him away, he finally lifted his head and looked across the courtroom directly at me. His dark eyes were filled with absolute sheer panic and a pathetic silent plea for mercy. I did not smile, and I did not frown. I simply held his gaze with a cold, steady indifference until he finally looked away and let the guards lead him out in heavy iron chains. He had traded his soul to sit at a table where he was never truly respected, and now he would spend the next 15 years paying the ultimate price for his boundless greed. The absolute poetic justice of my parents' fate was almost too perfect to believe. Patricia and Desmond had completely lost everything. The federal government had seized every single penny of their illicit offshore accounts, and their massive luxury suburban estate legally belonged to me. With absolutely zero financial resources and their reputations entirely destroyed, they had nowhere else to go. They were forced to move into the exact same run-down, decaying, low-income housing facility on the far industrial south side of Atlanta, where they had once forced dozens of evicted families to relocate. They were now living in a tiny, cramped apartment with peeling paint, dripping faucets, and paper-thin walls. The country club elite they had worshipped for decades completely turned their backs on them. Their phone numbers were blocked by every single person they had ever called a friend. They were entirely shunned by the Atlanta community they had once ruled. Every time they walked to the local grocery store, they had to face the very same neighbors they had helped displace. They were absolute pariahs trapped in a miserable concrete prison of their own making, forced to live out their remaining years, drowning in the bitter consequences of their own toxic vanity. While my former family languished in the ruins of their own greed, the legitimate legacy of my grandfather was finally allowed to bloom. Elias made an absolutely miraculous full recovery. The digitalis had nearly stopped his heart, but the brilliant medical team at Atlanta Memorial Hospital had managed to flush the poison from his system completely. The trauma had taken a physical toll on his frail body, leaving him reliant on a motorized wheelchair. But his brilliant mind was sharper and more focused than ever before. We spent the next 6 months working side by side, combining his decades of legitimate business wisdom with my elite forensic data skills. We took the massive clean assets he had secretly preserved, and we multiplied them. We did not buy luxury cars or sprawling estates. We invested every single dollar directly back into the community that had been so ruthlessly targeted. It was a beautiful, crisp autumn morning when we finally opened the doors to our new headquarters. The grand opening of the Elias Community Tech Center drew hundreds of people from across the city. We had completely renovated a massive abandoned building in the heart of downtown, transforming it into a state-of-the-art facility. The center was not just a symbol of recovery, it was a highly functional fortress of protection. Using my share of the recovered trust funds and my professional expertise, I had officially launched a massive financial literacy and cybersecurity firm housed directly inside the center. Our entire mission was dedicated to protecting minority-owned businesses and vulnerable homeowners from the exact same predatory practices that the Montgomery family had utilized. We provided free legal clinics, secure data protection, and comprehensive financial education to ensure that no one in our community would ever be exploited or tricked into signing away their generational wealth again. The sun was shining brightly as I walked up to the sleek wooden podium set up on the front steps of the beautiful new building. A massive crowd was gathered on the lawn, cheering and clapping loudly. Grandfather Elias sat proudly in his wheelchair in the front row, wearing a sharp-tailored suit and a bright, warm smile that completely erased the deep lines on his weathered face. He nodded at me, his dark eyes shining with absolute, undeniable pride. I gripped the edges of the podium and looked out over the crowd, feeling a profound sense of peace settle deep into my chest. I spoke clearly and passionately into the microphone, sharing our vision for a future where technology and financial literacy would serve as an impenetrable shield for our people. I talked about resilience, about rebuilding from the ashes, and about the undeniable power of truth. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause as I stepped back and helped my grandfather cut the thick red ribbon officially opening the center to the public. As the crowd began to file inside to tour the new facility, a familiar figure approached me from the edge of the lawn. It was Mr. Caldwell, the senior bank manager who had once threatened to have me arrested in the lobby of his pristine downtown branch. He looked incredibly humbled, his usual arrogant corporate demeanor completely replaced by genuine respect. He stopped in front of me and extended his hand. I shook it firmly, maintaining my steady, professional gaze. He apologized sincerely for everything that had happened and admitted that I had been entirely right from the very beginning. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a beautiful, heavy mahogany frame. He handed it to me with a small, respectful nod. Inside the pristine glass was the original cleared $200,000 emergency check that Grandfather Elias had written to me on that terrifying afternoon. The very same piece of paper that had contained the hidden tracking chip, the ultimate dead man switch that had brought the entire Montgomery empire crashing down. Caldwell told me he thought I should keep it as a reminder of the day everything changed. I thanked him quietly and held the heavy frame against my chest, feeling the incredible weight of the journey that had brought me to this exact moment. I walked into the building and took the private elevator up to the top floor. My new corner office was absolutely breathtaking. Two massive walls of floor-to-ceiling glass offered a stunning panoramic view of the entire Atlanta skyline. The afternoon sun bathed the modern room in a warm golden glow. My desk was a sleek slab of polished dark wood completely free of clutter. I walked over to the wall behind my desk and carefully hung the mahogany frame perfectly centered. I took a step back and looked at the cleared check resting securely behind the glass. It was a monument to survival, to forensic brilliance, and to absolute justice. I walked over to the massive windows and looked down at the bustling city below. The streets were alive with movement and possibility. I was completely alone, but I was no longer lonely. The constant suffocating anxiety that had plagued my entire life was entirely gone. I was no longer the ugly college dropout my parents had despised. I was no longer the convenient scapegoat for my brother's pathetic failures. I was no longer the punching bag for a family that measured human worth in zip codes and luxury brands. I had stripped away every single toxic expectation they had ever placed on my shoulders, and I had burned their fake empire to the ground, using nothing but my own mind. I had saved my grandfather, protected my community, and built something incredibly beautiful from the ashes of their absolute ruin. I was the architect of my own empire, and I had built my foundation on solid, unbreakable rock. The soft, rhythmic chiming of my office phone broke the quiet stillness of the room. I walked over to the sleek desk and glanced at the caller identification display glowing on the screen. It was a highly encrypted, secure line routing from a massive new prospective high-profile client in Washington, who desperately needed my elite forensic cybersecurity expertise to track down a massive international fraud syndicate. They had specifically requested my agency because my reputation for absolute ruthless precision was now known across the entire country. I reached out and picked up the receiver, holding it steadily to my ear. I looked out at the bright, beautiful skyline one last time, taking a deep, calming breath of clean, clear air. My voice was steady, powerful, and utterly undefeated as I spoke into the phone. "This is Raven. I am ready to begin." True power does not stem from inherited wealth, societal status, or the conditional approval of toxic family members. It comes from inner strength, unyielding resilience, and the courage to define your own worth. When a manipulative environment tries to tear you down, the ultimate revenge is not found in their destruction, but in building your own successful reality. You must refuse to carry the heavy weight of their false narratives. By cutting the ties that bind you to their expectations, you become the architect of your own empire. Please share your personal story below and subscribe for more empowering content.